Good morning and welcome to this remote seminar on integrating human and organizational factors in railway automation. This seminar is organized remotely this year by the European Union Agency for Railways in Valenciennes. I'm Dorothea and will be your moderator today. Let me please first give the floor to our Executive Director, Dr. Josef Doppelbauer, for some introductory words. Josef, could you please put your microphone and share your presentation with us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothea, and good morning to everyone. Today's online seminar is bringing together experts from a diverse range of fields, focusing on the integration of railway automation and human factors. We will have presentations from a wide range of perspective, and this will show how we can increase safety, enhance performance, and increase user satisfaction. We also will look at the integration of the system components and humans, and we will consider behavioral factors at all levels and individual situations. Now, automation has always been driven by two desires. The first one is to make our lives easier. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? To make our life easier, and the second one was to avoid human errors. So we have a number of opportunities from rail automation, but it is a myth to think that automation can eliminate all human errors from a socio-technical system like railways. The human contribution is not removed, but rather moved from the operational level to a different level, namely the design, supervision, and maintenance, certification, and regulation. The integration of human and organizational factors will still be necessary. While there are many opportunities with automation, there are also some challenges. If we go to the next slide, please. Here are some examples. The first issue is an issue of trust, because there may be both overtrust that the potential and the expectation on automation are overestimated and not reasonable. But there is also the potential problem of undertrust, meaning society has a negative perception, for instance, of an unmanned cab, or mistrust in automation because of potential sabotage or potential switching off. There are, of course, also new safety risks. It may all be fine in normal situation, but in degraded modes, it can be devastating, because then a higher density of traffic is to be managed, and we are not always sure what the system does to avoid hard failures or the exposure to cyber security. If a train driver doesn't know what automation is doing and when what action is performed, it is not always clear what is happening. And therefore, we are not always sure how the train driver will react when the train should be brought to a safe situation. Of course, automation can create new possibilities for human errors because of the additional complexity and possible misconfiguration or bad maintenance. Then we have, of course, the change of roles, and we need to clarify the responsibilities. We also need to cope with the increasing technical complexity, because sometimes automation is based on an oversimplified model of the railway system. If the model is too simplistic, the potential danger of flexibility and the impact on resilience will be more important. Of course, the final point is the responsibility. Who is in charge, the human or the machine? And This is something that we need to consider when such an automated system is designed. And this would potentially also lead to hidden costs of automation. We have less staff cost, but higher qualifications. And of course, there is retraining necessary. If we look on the next slide, there is a number of lessons that can be learned from other transport modes where the integration of human and organizational factors has long been recognized as essential. You might all be aware of a recent or some recent accidents in aviation, the famous Boeing 737 MAX. And these accidents have, of course, shown us that automation also needs to be regulated. And in this seminar, there will be presentation both from a national safety authority and from a national investigation body. Now, on the final slide, we will in this seminar also have a leading academic who will look at the psychological effects of automation on the human being and what can be done to mitigate the associated risk to manufacturers who need to integrate human and organizational factors in their design process. I will now hand back to Dorothea, the moderator, who will lead us to the first session. And Dorothea will make some introductory remarks before the first session on why human and organizational factors are important in automation will start. I wish you a very interesting and successful online seminar. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josef, for clearly pointing out the challenges of automation in railways. Indeed, today, for the first time remotely, the agency continues its the year, a high-level human and organizational factors seminar. Even though, unfortunately, this year we cannot meet in person, we are very, very happy to welcome all attendees of this remote seminar, and we are looking forward to the discussion in the chat or after the seminar. Indeed, as our director pointed out, railways are currently experiencing a kind of automation revolution, which may entail a lot of opportunities and benefits. However, we know that if the human input into the system is not considered, there is a threat to its safe and efficient operation. When I asked my expert colleagues, Jane and Clarisse in the agency, about human and organizational factors, they told me that it is a multidisciplinary field focusing on how to increase safety, enhance performance, as well as increase user satisfaction. Human and organizational factors refer to the interactions among the system components on the one hand and human beings on the other hand, considering their behaviors at all levels, individual, situational, group, organization, or cultural. We are very pleased. Welcome Dr. Itiel Dror. He is a renowned cognitive neuroscientist and leading academic on the impact of on human beings. We also welcome Jean Pariet, scientific director of the Institute for Industrial Culture in France, called ICSI, who will benchmark with automation in aviation. Later on today, case studies will give an insight on a return of experience of organizations that have integrated human and organizational factors in their railway automation project. Last but not least, tomorrow we will have a look at the regulatory aspects. Both a national safety authority and the national investigation body will highlight the challenges and opportunities to integrate human and organizational factors in their activities with regard to automation. As usual, each presentation will be followed by a short question and answer session. Don't hesitate to write your questions using the chat function in this Teams Live tool. And if you think some questions from other attendees are particularly important, please tag them using the thumb icon. At the end of each presentation, our expert speakers will answer the most tagged questions. All the other questions we will answer in the coming days on our webpage. Now let's go ahead, and may I give the floor to Dr. Itiel Dror. I'm very excited to hear your presentation. Itiel, please put your microphone on and share your slides with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clear.
And can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Well, I'm sharing my screen. You can't see my slide?
I don't see them yet. Let's see. No, we don't see your slides yet.
I didn't see the slides of the director either, by the way.
Yeah, would you like us to show the slides for you so that Jana...
As I explained, you do not have my slides. And also when the director was speaking, I could not. I don't know about the other participants. I heard him, but didn't see his slides. So
then we must try to get... now it's there. Okay. It's a slight delay, but please go ahead, Itiel.
And you can see my slides, yes?
Yeah, perfectly.
Excellent. So I'm very happy to be here today and to talk to you about the impact of automation on human biases and intelligence. As the director said, and most of us have a lot of hope for automation, to increasing productivity, for having a safer railway system. However, if we don't think about the human organizational factors, we have a lot of false beliefs, we have obstacles, and we have a myth of what automation actually does. So today I'm going to talk, I can perhaps change the title to the good and the bad impact of automation, because there is a good impact, but there is also bad, there's obstacles that we really need to consider, because having automation by itself doesn't really help if we don't do it properly. So I'm going to talk about the good and the bad. It's a huge topic because we're going to be talking about the human mind and how automation impacts it. So I have a lot to cover, and I'm going to mention a lot of research. I put my email if people want any of the research, and I will leave time at the end for questions, but if you are not able to ask your question, you can email it to me later. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are a bit sensitive. I'm going to talk about accidents, human error, intelligence, biases. So it is a bit sensitive topic. And today we're taking the first step in this journey. It's a long and complicated journey. Today, only the first step, but it's going to be a big step. So I'm going to cover a lot of material, and I'm going to challenge people. I'm going to challenge you. Try not to get defensive and to blame the messenger, but I want you to think out of your normal boxes to show you different perspectives of obstacles in automation. It's not all good news. The last thing before I start, I just want to thank a lot of people working very hard behind the scene to make all of this happen. The participants are seeing a great presentation today and tomorrow, but you know, you have the IT system, and Clarice and a lot of people who've worked very hard to make it happen. And I want to thank all of them. And special thanks to Jane, because Jane has really worked very hard on this event and to bring me here. So thank you to everyone, and a special thanks to Jane. So let's start talking about the human mind. We go around, we make decisions, judgment, we perceive risk, we manage risk, and think that what governs the human mind is all nice, what drives our mind. Unfortunately, often we don't make good decisions. Sometimes we're smart, but sometimes, I'm stupid, I make mistakes. We don't always make correct decisions. And the question is, when am I smart? When am I making the right decisions? And when I make mistakes, when I make errors, when accidents can happen, when I don't do very, very well. And this is a huge question of when I make good decisions and make bad decisions. After the event, after an accident, after I did something wrong, I know about it. But that's hindsight. The question is, before and while I make decisions, how do I know if I'm doing the right thing or if I'm doing the wrong thing? That's a big question. Now we need to ask, how does automation fits in it? So from a big question, we have a bigger question now. How does automation involve understanding, making good and not very good, making bad decisions? When do we usually, as people, are prone to take risk, not manage risks, make accidents, and make wrong decisions? And automation is going to help us. This is a good, moving us from the mistakes to driving our mind and the railway system better. And when it's the other way around, where automation, this is the bad, when automation can actually cause us to make mistakes. We want to know when, why that happens, and how that happens, so we can improve it, right? We want to increase the good, where automation can help us improve performance, improve safety, and minimizes automation causing accidents, reducing productivity, and causing problems because of human and organizational factors. To do that, we need to start thinking, we need to start understanding what drives our perceptions, our judgments, our decision-making. The brain, right? The brain, the human mind, how it processes our information, how we manage the risk, and how the blue balls, the information coming into the brain, are manipulated and understood by the brain. We have the information coming into the brain, the data of what we perceive. We call that bottom-up information, but also we have what we call top-down information, what's in our brain already. And these two interact and determine what we perceive and how we manage and perceive risk, how we reach decisions and judgments. So we have the bottom-up. Information arrives from the retina to the brain, is processed. We call that the bottom-up. And we have the top-down, where existing knowledge in the brain guides how we guide information. The top-down process interferes and guides how we perceive the world. This is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. This is the basis of human intelligence and expertise. We were not born yesterday. We have experience, we have expectation, we have training. We don't take information in face value. However, it can always cause mistakes because our decisions and our perception and our performance is not only based on the data out there, but what actually the brain does with it. This is why smart people do stupid things, exactly because of that. The bottom line that we need to take on board is the human mind is not a camera. The brain is active, it interacts with automation, it's impacted by automation and by many other factors, and we need to think about that and not take the brain and the mind as a passive instrument. The mind is not a camera. This has to do with a neural plasticity. The brain has neural plasticity. It's dynamic, it adapts, it changes all the time, and automation, as we introduce more and more automation, our brain adapts, it affects our intelligence, it affects how we think, and our biases. And it does it for good, and it does it for bad. It's not only good. Automation is not going to necessarily increase safety and increase performance. It can cause accidents, and we want to maximize and optimize the automation so we get the good and minimize the bad. And to do that, we have to think of the human element, of the human factor, of the organizational factors as we add automation more and more. This is very, very critical, and we're only going to see increase in automation. So we really need to think about it ahead of time as much as possible. To do that, we need to understand how the brain works, and B, how does automation impact the brain? Of course, today I said it's one step, and I'm not going to be able to explain the brain. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I've been studying the brain for decades, and I know very little about it. And then thinking, how does automation impact? So today is a first step of giving you some feeling of what I'm talking about. So let's talk about automation. So in automation, we're dividing the work between the human and the automation, right? And we're talking not only physically that automation has helped us physically do things, but what we call cognitive technology, cognitive automation. So the automation includes cognitive operations. It helps us monitor train. It helps us remember to do things. It does things for us. And this kind of automation that works with us on the cognitive level of thinking and perceiving, monitoring, paying attention, is where we get distributed cognition. This is why we're talking about the human mind. Before automation, cognition was in the individual, inner brain. Now the operations of the cognitive operations of managing risk, perceiving risk, making judgments and decisions is distributed between people and automation. And this can happen at a variety of different levels. The first level is offloading, right? We can offload things that automation helps us, right? I don't need to remember birthdays. I don't need to remember phone numbers. I don't even have to remember meetings because my iPhone is going to give me alert before the meeting. So I'm working with technology, even a smartphone, that I don't have to remember so much. I offload some of my operations from my brain onto the automation, onto the technology. At a harder, at a more deeper level, we are partners. It's not just offloading and technology and automation is here to help me. I'm the boss and the automation is supporting me, but we can collaborate. It can be a partnership between the human and the automation, or we can get to a level where actually the automation is doing most of the operations. The human is even subservient. We monitor it, we check it, we can override it, but automation is predominantly doing what needs to be done. From moving kind of in this distributed cognition, from offloading to collaborating, that technology starts helping us to working together to basically taking over all the operations that we are doing. And we see it in every domain of our life, driving, aviation, healthcare, military, banking. We have more and more automation and more distributed cognition. If we talk, for example, about offloading, we take an example of driving, right? Then I don't need these days, when I started to drive, I had to remember to put on a seatbelt. Now I don't have to remember to put on a seatbelt because if I forget, a light is going to go on in the car and the car is going to start going beep, 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 beep to draw my attention to remind me to put on a seatbelt. So I don't need to have it on my checklist to remember to put the seatbelt because the car is going to remind me. Even more, turning the lights off in the evening. When I started to drive, I had to remember to turn on the lights. And I would remember there were some people who forgot, and you drive at night and suddenly the car that doesn't have the lights on because they forgot to turn it on, and I would flash my lights to remind them. Here, it's not only that the car doesn't need to remind me, the car turns on the lights automatically. I don't need to bother when I'm getting into the car, when I'm driving, to think, is it dark or is there fog and rain? The car automatically does that. And the same goes for many other operations. If you started to drive a long time ago, like me, I would even have to remember to turn off the turn signal. When I would turn left or right, it wouldn't turn off automatically. So this is examples where of offloading, where the automation helps me as a driver to take off my brain, off my mind, some of the operations. But we can also move to partnership, to collaborating, right? So now the car collaborates with me. In parking, we collaborate, right? In braking, we collaborate, yeah? Because when I park, I have sensors, I have camera, and the car is collaborating with me. When I have to press the brakes, it's not like the olden days where before anti-lock brakes, where I had to remember, and it was a cognitive load, not to press the brakes too hard because the wheels will lock. Since we have anti-lock brakes, then when I brake the car in a case of emergency, we collaborate. And the same goes, you know, when I'm navigating, when I'm driving, I have the GPS, and the car says turn left, turn right. And if it's near my house where I know, you know, I don't always take their advice. I say, oh, the GPS doesn't know what it's doing. I'm going to turn left or try something else. I can work and collaborate with the GPS system. The final level is the human being almost subservient, right? We have right now automatic parking. We don't collaborate. The car parks itself automatically. I don't need to collaborate in stopping the car. If the car is going to have an accident, if it's going to hit a pedestrian, my car overrides and actually stops. And of course, if we're talking about driverless cars, you know, cars that drive by themselves, self-driving cars, then they navigate, they do everything for us. So this is kind of an illustration in driving, and the same in aviation. I work a lot in aviation and in the medical domain, where we see huge amount of automation, from offloading to collaborating to the technology and automation taking over. You know, in railways, the people here, the railway people, engineers, can bring many examples, but you can think about the signal box operations, or the olden days, if you want to go back, where people had to go with a red or green light to signal to the trains if they can go or not, and physically had to divert different trains to different tracks, to more and more automation, physically doing it and physically giving the signals, to automation monitoring trains, to alerting the human when trains are going to collide, and so on and so forth. So we see more and more of this kind of automation. And as we rely more on automation, then it's not all going to be good. It can also cause problems. It's a good and a bad. Let me give you an example. I want to give you an example of the good and the bad of how automation impacts us and how we have obstacles and challenges. And I want to not only show you an example, I want you to understand from a cognitive perspective, from a brain human factor perspective, what the problems and challenges in automation. And automation is very good. I'm not against automation, but I'm saying to optimize automation, to avoid pitfalls, vulnerabilities, the risks we have in automation, we have to think of the human and organizational factors. If not, we're going to have some serious problems. So let's think of an example and understand the brain. We have to understand that the brain, the human mind, has limited resources. What we talk about is cerebral cellular metabolism. I won't explain to you what that is, but the bottom point is that we have limited capacity, limited computational power. The information arriving into the brain is huge, and the brain cannot process all of it. When I say the brain cannot process all of it, I don't mean we process, 90% or 80%. We process a very, very small, a minute amount of the information actually arriving into the brain. a lot of information comes in, what we see and all what we hear, what we smell, what we touch, and all of this comes into the brain. The eyes don't filter out information. It all comes into the brain, and we get a huge amount of cognitive overload. Here's a picture of coffee beans. Try to see if you can see a human face. Between all the coffee beans, there is a human face. It's the size of one of the coffee beans. So can you see the face between all the coffee beans? I'll give you a few seconds. It's very hard to see. Here's the face. Do you see the face now? I put a red circle around it. Why most people don't see that? Because it is too much information. It overwhelms the brain. The brain cannot pick up a face. Even though faces are something that the brains are built to pick up. There's a certain tendency. We have a tendency to pick up faces. It's too much load. And if we load too much on the human operator, on the human engineer, on the operator in the signal box, or whatever the case may be, it's too much load. The brain cannot take it. And what happens is we get all this information. We just can't really do anything. We end up like an ass in the air. If we load too much information, it's too much for the brain, and we are like asses in the air. And this is what happens, right? This is what happens to all of us. And this is only the workplace when we go and do some operation in railway or anything else at the workplace, and not to mention that we have a life, right? Our kid is sick, our parents are in a senior home, we're worried about COVID, we're worried about paying the bill, and our kids have a problem at school or whatever is going on. So we come to do our operations, to manage risk, to make sure we have good performance and safe performance. Our brains already loaded with things, and then we get to work, it's even loaded even more, and we end up like acids in the air. We can't do what we're supposed to do. Now, the question is, how does automation fit into that? So automation creates a lot of this cognitive overload, right? So automation creates overload because there's a lot of available information. That automation and technology enables a lot of information to come. So there's a lot of availability, and very quickly. While automation was slow, I would sit and scratch my head waiting for the automation to give me the information. Now, the automation is very quickly, gives me a lot of information, and I, the human, have to keep up with all this information coming in, which is increasing because of automation, and I have to pay attention to so many things, and I'm expected to increase productivity because automation is giving me a lot of information in high speed, right? This creates more and more cognitive load and overwhelming us. And there are many other things that automation is not doing a good job because it's creating a lot of the cognitive overload. On the other hand, that technology also is reducing the cognitive load, right? We talked about offloading, partnership, collaborating, and taking over some of what we've done. So technology and automation also helps reduce the cognitive load. So here you see a very clear picture of the good and the bad, that automation creates cognitive load, but automation also reduces cognitive load. Now it gets more complicated. I said I'm going to give you an example to understand, but it gets much more complicated than this, and I'll explain and give you the example, the illustration. What happens as we rely more and more on automation, as we use automation more and more? What happens? The reducing cognitive load happens, but also we get bored, right? From sometimes automation and the environment giving us a lot and overwhelming us, it's doing so much, we're bored, we're doing nothing. We sit in the signal box operator, sit there and have to do nothing. They have to wait for an accident going to have to happen, and they're monitoring the screen, looking when an accident or where a problem is going to occur. 95% of the time we sit and do nothing. And the same in aviation and in medical, in many domains, right? From being overwhelmed, we're getting bored, basically. We're falling asleep. There's not much that we're going to be doing. and we're losing vigilance. We're not engaged anymore. We're kind of not engaged and paying attention to things because automation is doing more and more for us. So they're reducing the cognitive load. The arrow going down is turning from green, from reducing the load, that it's causing a negative effect, right? This is the bad and the good, and this is what we call the inverted U effect, right? When you look at the benefit and the automation, then as you increase automation, you get more and more benefit, but you get to a level that if you over increase automation, then the benefits decrease. And of course, we're not talking about the amount of automation, but how we do the automation, how the automation interfaces with the human factors, how we distributed cognition between the automation and the human, and think of the organization, the human factors. If we do it correctly, they complement one another, they work together. If not, they can interfere, and over automation or certain kinds of automations actually will not reduce accidents, will not increase safety, will not increase productivity. We have to understand the obstacles and the risks involved with automation so we can overcome them. And this is not theoretical. This is exactly what happened. I'll give you an example from aviation. Continental flight 3407 was a flight from New York to Buffalo, and the plane crashed, killed 50 people, died in that accident. And I can talk about this case alone for many hours. And what happened here is automation intended to improve safety and performance actually caused, if not contributed to the accident. And you're welcome to read the National Transport Safety Board, NTSB, in the United States review and finding as per what automation actually achieved. And this is exactly the example that I wanted to give you for a bit more deep understanding, that in flight, there was too much information. You know, in Vietnam War, the pilots would turn off a lot of the communications and automation because they were overwhelmed with so much information in the cockpit that they couldn't handle it, and they physically shut down different channels so they can focus on what they needed to do. So the automation to reduce the cognitive load. But in this case of the Continental flight that crashed on the way to Buffalo, the automation reduced the cognitive load so much that the pilots were bored. All they had to do is monitor a few things, and they got bored. They started talking, they were distracted because they were not engaged. Automation did so much. So this is an example, a bit complicated, to show you, if you remember, about automation. This is a slide I showed you a few minutes ago, that automation, the distributed cognition, it's good, but it's good and bad. And as we go down and add in more automation and reduce the cognitive load and help people, we have to think of the impact on the human and the human factors involved with it. Now, why don't we talk a bit about biases and intelligence and the impact, the good and bad impact of automation on our skills? Yes, this is all critical things that are important for us if we want to get it correct. So if you remember, we talked about neuronal plasticity, about the top-down cognitive brain processes. The human mind is not a camera, right? It's dynamic, it's responsive, it's flexible. This is the characteristics of the brain. First of all, it's a great characteristic. That's what makes us so intelligent. And whether we like it or not, this is the way the human brain works, right? So in the brain, we have use it or lose it. You know, if we don't use the brain, if we don't use certain skill, they degrade, we lose it because the brain adapts, right? My car had all these sensors. I used to, when I learned to drive a car for decades, I was the best parallel parker. I could park in a very small space. First time I would go in, no question, doesn't matter. Everyone was impressed, including myself. Now I've been driving quite a lot of time, with modern cars that have the monitors and have sensors. And then I had to drive last week a car, an old car that didn't have those sensors. I couldn't park the car, what I used to do once. I tried 2 times. It took me 10 times to park into a big space, right? So I lost a lot of the skills. The brain, because of its neural plasticity, it's use it or lose it, right? So what happens with automation? We think less, we do less, right? And we get skill degradation in what we are able to do. Let me show you some examples. And again, we're only taking a first step to a very complicated set of issues. So let's take literacy. You know, this is something very basic, which has been existing for thousands of years, 5,000, 10,000 years. Reading and writing reduced our intelligence because it reduced human memory capacity. I'm not talking, these days, I don't remember phone numbers. I used to remember phone numbers. People don't even know their own phone numbers. And if you do a digit span memory, people are not as good at it. But this is a small change. Literacy was a huge cognitive technology that introduced. Now imagine before we could read and write, then we had to remember, we had to memorize a lot of information, and the memory capacity of the brain was really, really powerful. Our ability to read and write, which is like every technology, it's great, but it enables us to write down things. As we write down things, we have not needed to remember so many things, and the brain memory's ability, capacity has decreased. So we find a reduction in our intelligence because we can read and write in terms of ability to remember. Think about photography. Again, I don't want to sound too old, but when I started to take pictures, I had to go to a store. I had to buy a film that cost a lot of money. There were 36 pictures in a roll. And then I had to go to the store and pay money for them to develop it into negative and to print it. Before I took a picture, I would think twice which picture to take, right? I have to think because I had 36 pictures and it cost a lot of money. Now, with all this automation and technology, which I love, what do we all do? We take pictures all the time. Not only we never look at the pictures because we have hundreds, we have thousands of pictures, right? But we don't think twice. There's no price to taking a picture. So we think less of how to take the picture. You just take a picture, it doesn't cost us anything. And driving, again, we talked about driving, but we don't know much, right? When they started driving a car, you needed to, when cars came out, you needed to know how the car works. You need to know how to fix it. You carried half of the spare parts to fix it. Now, people don't know even how to change a spare tire. My new car doesn't have a spare tire because they have this gas you put in that fills it, right? It fills it automatically. People don't know a lot of things because the car does it, including staying vigilant because, for example, with cruise control, I turn cruise control, then, the car automatically is driving. I don't engage. I'll give you one last example, and I can give many, many more examples. I want to leave time for questions. In the end, doing statistics, right? So my PhD students, every time they drive me crazy because we have software, SPSS and whatever to do statistics. In the olden days, even before my days, then people computed statistics by hand. So before you calculated standard deviations and ANOVA and t-test or whatever you did, it would take you days, weeks, hours and hours to calculate it by hand. You would think very carefully what to do, what statistical analysis. These days, my students, they don't look at the data, they just plug it into the statistical software, do one analysis, do another analysis, without really thinking and even looking, what does the data mean? What does the data look like? What should we do? They just try everything because there is no cost, there is no effort in doing that. So what all of these examples show, and I can give many, many more examples, that automation is spoiling us, right? And it's good here. That's what automation is here. It's not to make our life more difficult. It's to spoil us, to help us, to reduce accidents, to make us more productive. But it also makes the brain lazy, right? Because if we're spoiled, we sit, we do nothing. The technology is doing more and more for us. Now, if you combine it with the brain's neuroplasticity and adaptivity, use it or lose it. The human mind is not a camera, what I talked about. What happens is our abilities to do things decrease, our thinking ability, our perception, our flexibility, responsiveness, all those great skills that we had. And just one more example, my kids, when they go out, I sleep well because they have mobile phones, they have cell phones. I know that if they have a problem, they call me. If I want to reach them, I can call them. That's great. But you know what? My kids, maybe I shouldn't say that, they're a bit incompetent. Why? Because when I was 16, when I was 17, and I went out and I had a problem, I couldn't call my mommy and daddy to ask them what to do. I had to deal with it. I developed abilities of decision making, of judgment, because I had to cope with the situation. Now, mobile technology, which again is great, this new generation, my kids call me and I love it. Daddy, what to do? This happened. Daddy, what to do? But they lose their ability to think independently. And these are all automation things that we really need to understand and think and do in this area. So we need, this is kind of the bottom line, to think about the risks and the obstacles as we use and rely more and more automation. And I'm not against, I'm very much for automation. I love automation, and it's going to increase our reliance. But when we embrace it, we need to think about the cognitive and human factors. So we see here our intelligence is increasing and decreasing as a result of technology. In the few last minutes that I'm going to be talking right now, I'll talk about human biases and then answer any questions that people may have. Okay, as with intelligence, the same thing goes to human biases, right? So automation and the computations and technology and instrumentation, all what we do in many ways reduces a lot of the human biases in how we perceive the environment, in how we make judgments and decisions. But also it can increase biases and even create new biases, right? So what happens is that biases are hidden implicitly in automation. And biases, you know, is a very big topic, and it's a very important topic. And lately, there's a lot of talk about human biases. And I separate the different sources of human biases to biases that happen because of the situation. There's a specific situation that this situation has caused a bias in our judgment, in our perception of risk, in our actions. Then there are sources of biases that have got nothing to do with the situation. It has to be with the individual doing the judgment, their education, their training, their past experience, the organizational culture they're working in. Something about the person and their environment has caused the bias. And we have things that are part of human nature that we all have, because we're human. It doesn't matter about the specific situation or the specific person. And there's 8 different sources. I don't have time to get into all of them. But for example, we have organizational factor, base rate expectation. And I wish I would have time, because each one of them I would talk about for an hour, and how automation really doesn't always help, and sometimes can make things even worse, because it all depends on the cognitive processing that happens behind this. And as we think about the brain, as we think about automation, we also have to remember, and I just mentioned it as one last issue, is what happens when an accident occurs. When an accident occurs, because of the automation, because of the instrumentation, nevertheless, the organizations often blame the human. the engineer, the box signal operator, because if the automation, if the instrumentation failed, the company, the agency has responsibility. But if the human was not doing their job, if they didn't follow the standard, the procedures and the standards and stuff like that, then it's not the company's fault, they're not legally liable. But the problem that many of the operations, many of the standard operating procedures are no good, right? They're no good. What do I mean they're no good? They sound wonderful when you read them, they make a lot of sense, but they don't take the human factor, the human element into consideration. Consider passwords. What are the standards for password? What are the regulations? They sound great. They have to be at least 8 characters long, and they have to have uppercase and lowercase, and you're not allowed to write them anywhere, and you're not allowed to use the same password for different places. All of this sounds good, but this IT security people, they're not thinking about the cognitive factors. You don't have to be a brain expert, a cognitive neuroscientist to know that nobody memorizes these passwords, right? What can you remember? What we have 20, 30 accounts from banking to email to whatever, and each one has a password, and each one has a different password with different upper and lower case characters, and they want us to change it every 3 months. So they give us this beautiful sounding regulations and standards of how to have IT security by having these passwords and not writing them down, etc., etc., but they don't work because they don't take the human factor into consideration. And that's what we need to do as we think about the brain. When we started, if you remember, then we talked about good decisions and bad decisions and how automation can actually cause us to make better decisions, and when it can cause us to make more mistakes because we're not vigilant, or what the other things we talked about, and understanding and started to think. And today, just to provoke you, to challenge you, to start thinking why automation and how automation can improve performance, productivity, and safety, but also when and how, what are the risks and the obstacles in automation, how they can cause us to miss things, to have less productivity, and even cause accidents. What I talked about in terms of the good, and also what I talked to in terms of the bad. So that's where we started today. Thank you very much for listening, and I've left time for questions if you have any. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Itiel, for this really mind-opening appetizer. I have some very interesting questions that came in the chat. Let me read one highly tagged question out to you. What could be the long-term impact of a highly distributed cognition? Is the brain going to be more lazy?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So first of all, when it comes to technology and automation, the changes are so huge that I don't want to predict what's going to happen, in 20 years. If I can predict a bit, I will do my best. Yes, so the brain is lazy. As we do more and more technology, then we're going to lose a lot of our abilities. However, we're going to gain new abilities, right? There are certain abilities that are changing. It's not all downhill. I always get amazed at university, and now when you walk the streets, before COVID, you have thousands of people walking. All of them are texting. They don't bump into one another. So this kind of ability, to text. The same thing when my kids send me text, I always send it back to them. I say, I can't read it. There's no commas, there's no periods. I can't understand the text. I'm not trying to be difficult. They can read without commas and periods and text. So the abilities degrade, but we get new ability because the brain is dynamic. but it gives us a big reliance of automation. What happens when automation is not working and we don't have the abilities anymore and we rely on automation? And how the world is changing as you use more and more automation, the way we work together, the way we communicate. Let me give you one more example. The first time in my home that one of the kids didn't talk to me, they texted me in the house, I was very angry. I said, what do you mean you texted me? Bring your butt downstairs and going to talk to me face to face. They don't talk face to face anymore. But over time, I realized this is their mode of communication. If I really want to know what's going on with the kids, if I want them to share with me, they'll do it by text. They're not used to speaking face to face. They're not used to reading facial gestures as well as I did because they don't have so much face to face interaction. So I would say, and I have said, and answering this question, yes, the automation and more reliance on technology is going to degrade their abilities. The brain is lazy by its very nature. It's really not lazy. It optimizes. It's very efficient. Use it or lose it. But it's not only down. We're seeing a change of abilities, and that has far-reaching implications to how we select people for the job, how we train people, and how people work together between them. All of this is a changing world that is changing drastically as a result of automation, and this is in many day-to-day life of how we live our life, how we drive our car, in medicine, in driving, and of course in railway and aviation, where we don't allow ourselves and shouldn't allow ourselves to make mistakes that result in accidents. So we need to have a proactive. We can't wait for an accident to learn. We need to be proactive, and as we embrace automation, we need to think about not forget the humans. We forget the humans too often. We need to take them into account and think of the organizational and human factors in order to integrate and distribute cognition in the most effective way.
Yes, very interesting, Itiel. There is a lot of questions. I see very specific railway-related questions, questions related to risk assessment methods for human and organizational factors, which we will address later in this seminar or answer on our website. But there is one for you here, Itiel, on monotone repetitive tasks. In railways, you know, there is the dead man switch where the driver has to push a button to show he's still alive. And does a monotone repetitive task like activating a dead man switch has an impact on the quality of attention, the vigilance of the driver in this case? And is this kind of conditioning really useful to stir the attention?
Okay, so a very good question. First of all, for the first part on specific risk perception and management in railways, we can go into the details, and today and tomorrow we'll be going to details, and you can go over the details with me. I'll just make a comment similar to the password examples. A lot of standards can look good and sound good, but don't really properly integrate and consider the human and cognitive factors. So that's one comment in the beginning of the question. But to the main part of the question, yes, absolutely huge impacts to this kind of attention and perception. I'll give you an example in airports, right? So in airports, we train people to look at the screen to see if there's a bomb or a gun and they carry on. So there's an X-ray, and people are really motivated. We really train them to pay attention. We show them picture of dead children and plane blowing up and say, 1 second, 2 seconds, you're not vigilant, you're not attending to the screen, and a bomb can go on the plane and you have killed all these people. So, we train people well, they're really motivated, hardworking, they're very competent, and they come to the airport in the first day and they look at the screen and all day, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb. And they come on the second day, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb. And they'll do it for 20 years. How many bombs are they going to find? 0 bombs, right? Every day. Before COVID, there were 6 to 8 million people flying a day. And when was the last time somebody tried to put a bomb or a gun on the plane and whatever? So the people, even though they're really, really engaged and really, really trying to be engaged, the brain shuts off. The brain automatically shuts off because the brain is efficient. It doesn't want to waste resources. And after some time that they watch the screen and they turn to experts and they know what they're doing, we put a bomb and they don't see it, even if it's a clear bomb, because the brain automatically is used to. That's a base rate. If you remember in my pyramid on biases, we call it base rate bias. So what they do in airport security, it's unclassified. You can find it on the proper web pages of the TSA in the United States. They have a system called TIP, T-I-P, Target Image Projection, to keep people vigilant and engaged. From time to time, the computer projects a bomb onto an X-ray of a suitcase. And then the person doesn't see it the first time, and the supervisor comes over and says, hey, look here, what is this? He said, oh, it's a bomb. I didn't see it. He said, well, strike one from this. It's not a real bomb, but I'm making sure you're paying attention. 3 strikes and you're out of here. And I'm going to do it from time to time. So from time to time, to keep the vigilance across, they use this system to keep the person engaged, giving counter examples to the base rate bias expectation. But it gets very, very complicated because a lot of the work in railroad, in driving, and signal operating are boxes that are similar to the medical domain to anesthesiologists. So anesthesiologists, what do? There's an operation, they put the patient to sleep, then the surgeon comes and does a surgery. And during the surgery that can go on for hours and hours, the anesthesiologist sits there bored, scratching their head. They've got nothing to do. They just monitor the life signs that the patient is fine. They're not doing very much while the surgeon is operating whatever operation they're conducting. However, from time to time, something goes wrong. In the middle of the operation, the blood pressure falls down, the patient is going to die, and then the surgeon stops the operation, and the anesthesiology takes over to try to make sure the patient doesn't die. So what you have here, during the operation, you move from total boredom, 95% of the time total boredom, to 5% of sheer panic, right? And this also happens, in the signal box when they're monitoring. Suddenly an accident is going to happen, and you move from 0 to 100 miles per hour, and you need to make sure that you do it properly and they're vigilant. So these are all complicated questions. I showed you in the aviation how they deal with it, but these are questions that we need to think about as we think about automation, vigilance, boredom, monotonic tasks, when the technology can take over, when the technology can offload and support, but in a way that the human still engages in the task and does what she or he has to do when an accident is going to happen, or whatever the case may be.
Yes, indeed, Itiel, there is a lot of consideration. It's not easy. It's on the one hand, we human beings are expected to provide flexibility, responsiveness in automated systems, and yet you said that these abilities will decrease the more we use automation. It sounds a bit like a no-win situation. How can we find the right balance? Could you help us a little bit on that, on this last question? What should we do?
Okay, first of all, I'm sorry for all the people who we have not had time to answer the questions, but you can email me and I'm happy to talk and send you paper. point number two, I want to add before I answer the question that it's even worse, right? Not only we expect people to stay responsive and stay alert, but then when something goes wrong, we blame the human. So if you remember, I talked about the bias to blame the human and not the automation. So it's a matter, when I say balance, it's not the quantity of interaction, it's a quality. And there is, the devil is in the details. And I've worked a lot in aviation and policing and medicine and other domains where we think about these issues. And the issues are not only automation, is training, right? We have to train people how to respond to things that happen very, very rarely, and how automation can help us. And the bottom line is that automation, A, whether we like it or not, it's coming in, it's being increased. And B, even if we had a choice, I think automation is great. It offers a lot of opportunities to increase safety, to increase productivity. But if is a big word, if we do it properly. So what can we do? We need to think about the human. Don't just throw the technology on the human and take the human for granted. Technologies do not work, many of them, and I've seen case after case, not because the technology doesn't deliver the technological specifications, because it doesn't work properly with the human. And this is always, or most often, forgotten. The technology is driving, the automation is driving the railway and what's doing, rather than the human and thinking of the human perspective. This is the elephant in the room. So as you develop automation, as you want to implement, as you train people, think all along about the organizational and the human factors of the human perspective, what we expect from the human, and don't be naive about the human brain and cognitive systems and what we can expect. Don't just throw the automation on the human and think that if you have automation, necessarily you're going to get better productivity and more safety. That doesn't go automatically. It's only if you think about the human perspective. So put a big sign above your door or above your computer. What about the human as you think about automation? What are the risks? What are the obstacles? And how we can overcome them?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Itiel. And I promise today and tomorrow, we will think a lot about the humans in European railways.